Verse 13, "Then one of the elders answered, saying to me, 'These who are clothed in the white robes, who are they, and where have they come from?' And I said to him, 'My Lord, you know.' And he said to me, 'These are the ones who come out of the Great Tribulation, and they have washed their robes, and made them white in the blood of the Lamb.'" For this reason, the elders question, "Who are these in the white robes?" And he answers his own question, and I like John's answer there. John is like, "You know the answer. Don't play with me," you know. And the elder says that these are the ones who come out of the Great Tribulation, and that raises a question, of course: what is the Great Tribulation? Now, I believe that the Old Testament background to this verse, I believe, is Daniel chapter 12, verse 1b. "There will be a time of distress such as has never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued." You might wonder, why do I think that Daniel chapter 12 is the Old Testament background for this thing that this elder says? Well, it's because of the language of the Daniel 12 passage. Daniel 12 talks about a time of great distress. That would sound very much like one language, Hebrew, saying the exact same thing that is said in the Greek, right? That sounds very similar to what's going on here. The context of Daniel chapter 12, let's go back to what is the most important, what are the three most important things in understanding any Bible passage? Context, context, and context, right? Three most important things in understanding any Bible passage. The context of Daniel chapter 12 is the end times. It mentions it in verse 3, it mentions it in verse 9, it mentions it in verse 13. And the context of Daniel chapter 12 is persecution of God's saints and a call to God's people remain faithful. Doesn't that sound like the entire book of the Revelation? Doesn't that sound like a great way to sum up the book of the Revelation? Persecution against God's people and a call to God's people to remain faithful. So why would Daniel 9, primarily verse 27, why would Daniel 9 not be the background for this? Well, once again, it's the language. The language of Daniel chapter 9, especially verse 25, it refers to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. It refers to the rebuilding of Jerusalem. The context of Daniel chapter 9 is the coming of the Messiah. There's no mention in Daniel chapter 9 about this being an end times or a latter day vision. Revelation, and specifically Revelation chapter 7 verse 14, it has no reference at all to anybody making covenants. It has no reference to anybody making covenants with Israel. Temple sacrifice and putting an end to temple sacrifice is not in the book of the Revelation, is it? And so Daniel chapter 12, the theme, the context, what's going on in Daniel chapter 12 fits very well with the book of the Revelation. Daniel chapter 9 doesn't fit with the book of the Revelation. Matthew chapter 24, verse 21, verse 29, also Mark chapter 13, Luke chapter 21. Some people have thought, well, Jesus mentions a great tribulation. Maybe that is what's going on here in the book of the Revelation. Matthew 24 is a very difficult passage to interpret. Now, don't hear in that statement from me that you may as well not even interpret it. That's not the point when I tell you that it's difficult to interpret it. My point there is to tell you, you got to be careful as you approach Matthew chapter 24. It's not that you can't, it's that you've got to be careful when you approach Matthew chapter 24. Jesus uses the second person personal pronoun you throughout Matthew chapter 24. Now in verse 2, the you in verse 2 is clearly the disciples who have come up to ask Jesus a question. He speaks to them. He says, you. It stands to reason then that the you in verse 6, the you in verse 9, the you in verse 15, and the you throughout the rest of the chapter, why has it changed? Why would he keep saying you if it's not the group that he's speaking to, because he's already identified them as you in verse 2? If, perhaps starting in verse 4, Jesus was talking about a future audience, people who haven't even been born yet, when did he start referring to them as them or they? The Great Tribulation verse, chapter 24, verse 12. Jesus mentions the Great Tribulation. Translating the Greek literally, it would translate, people will suffer more than at any other time since the beginning of the world, and nothing as terrible as this will ever happen again. That's what Jesus says about this. That means that Jesus is saying that the Great Tribulation he's referring to is something fixed. Nothing before it and nothing after it rivals it. And what that means is that the Great Tribulation that Jesus is referring to is something that happens within history. It's not something that happens at the end of history. Because he says that nothing after it will ever rival it. Well, the end of history, whatever comes after the end of history, it's not history. It's something different, you know. And if he's talking about heaven at that point, well, of course not. So why would you bother saying that? 24:15 through 22, the you in verse 15 is identical to the you in verse 2. The tribulation that Jesus is referring to is located in Judea. Verse 16. And by fleeing to the mountains, one could escape that tribulation. Therefore, Jesus is not talking in Matthew 24 about an end times worldwide global tribulation. Because he says that this happens in Judea, and he says the way to get out of the tribulation is to flee to the mountains. It's difficult. I'll remind you that John's first readers were facing tribulation. Chapter 2 verse 9, chapter 2 verse 10, that could end in their deaths, right? Remember, how does John start the letters? What does John say to the churches? I'm your fellow servant in tribulation. I'm also in tribulation on the Isle of Patmos. Antipas, there in chapter 2, verse 13, he was faithful unto death in Pergamum. Ephesus, Sardis, Laodicea, they were in danger of losing their identity as the people of God. Pergama and Thyatira, they were compromising their loyalty to Christ. Early tradition tells us that Peter and Paul were both martyred under Nero, as well as traditions that all the apostles except John faced martyrdom. Christians were tortured in horrific ways from Nero till the Edict of Milan in 313, and throughout the Roman Empire. Throughout history, Christians have been pressured to give up their faith and join the world system. This has been seen countless times in history. And one of the tragedies, hear this, one of the tragedies of the church is that Satan has been able to use the church in certain times to persecute other Christians. Now, I'm not saying that everybody in that sentence is a true believer or a true Christian, but I am saying that Satan was able to use the church to persecute Christians. Is that not a horrible fact from history? Today, there are places all over the world where you can literally be killed because you're a Christian. There are places where our brothers and sisters in Christ can literally face torture and death and loss of property and horrible, horrible tortures until they die. Now, you and I largely, here in the U.S., have been spared death. We've largely been spared death. That doesn't mean there are no Christian martyrs in the U.S. over the last 200, 300 years. Of course, Columbine and certain other events where somebody actually targeted Christians because of their faith. So there have been Christian martyrs. But one of the more interesting things is you look at the West, largely, and Satan hasn't put the mechanisms in place to kill Christians in mass numbers, that he's able to do that in other parts of the world and throughout world history. Does that mean that Satan has left the West alone and just said, oh, I just won't deal with those people? No, Satan has realized that he doesn't always have the ability to use death in the West. What does he do? He gets more creative. He has Hollywood. He has the music industry. He has a lot of tools where Christians today in America do not necessarily face life or death, but I want to ask you to point out a modern television show, popular, that doesn't have a homosexual character, that doesn't normalize cohabitation and premarital relations. That is a constant theme in our television shows, in our movies, trying to normalize immorality and trying to tell Christians, oh, you guys are just out of touch. You guys just are antiquated. Join the world system. Become one with us. Give up your old fairy tales and fables and whatnot. Does anybody remember what reverse psychology is? Reverse psychology is, I want you to do something, but I want you to think that it was your idea to do it. Satan has realized that in the West he doesn't get the death struggle that often. But he has found other ways to put Christians through tribulation.